client that wanted to do that, and so we looked at it, and we picked SQL injection because that was hard for them. And we looked at their applications, and on average, there were 38 points in any application that generated a single query. So when you talk about stamping out, SQL injection, when every one of them is constructed by 38 different code points, and how many different queries do you have in your application? Well, the blast radius of the changes associated with this application became almost as large as the application. And so we had a situation where fixing one bug, very simply, let's start simple, actually meant you had to consider the whole application. And that was very telling to watch the security guys come to the realization that the code was a plate of spaghetti and that they couldn't disambiguate that for the developers. And there was a lot of sort of humble pie eaten as the security guys had to crawl back into their offices and figure out what a solution for that was. Hear a lot of noise recently about, ASAPI being the flaming, silver arrow associated with fixing some of these things. And again, look at the code points, look at the blast radius of changes. It's hard to implement these fixes, even if they are well conceived as autonomous solutions. Are you going to double encode something? Are you going to, end up producing 404s? What is the ultimate result of these fixes? Having visibility into what the code will change, or what code will change, or what code will be affected, is a very important. Basically, it's still a research topic like it was 10 years ago. It's something I think we can help out a lot with, especially if you're working on tool stuff like O2, like code slicing, like static scanning stuff.
All right, thank you. Let us open up for Q&A.
Is there such a thing? And second question is there a common forum where they publish that information, that patch is available?
I'm not aware of one. Are you guys?
I think the answer to both questions is no and no. There's no, everyone seems to, honestly, I think the best way to do it at this point is CVSS, which many vendors do use, but not everybody does. Microsoft has their rating. Everyone has a different kind of rating system. But if it was up to me, everyone would be using CVSS, which still doesn't tell you what's the likelihood of you actually getting owned, but it's a step in the right direction. But then there's certainly no common. I mean, not every vendor is pumping out to mailing lists when they patch something. It just ends up on their website.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but if a vendor displays information about a patch, they usually show some information about how serious they think a flaw is that they're fixing already, right? So the question is, if the vendor already says, hey, it's a serious flaw, wouldn't you want to just go and fix it, right? Or patch it?
I don't know that you do. Again, you don't know what the change is going to be. You don't know if it's going to completely break the app. I mean, the problem with Spring vulnerabilities is that they're central to the purpose of Spring. So in essence, when someone points out there's a vulnerability in Spring, they're basically saying there's a fundamental design flaw. That could be argued, but I mean, so you really have to look at, okay, well, do I actually have to switch toolkits? You may have some compensating control or mitigating factor that their assessment of the severity does not take into account. This is consistently the case for things like authentication authorization, where there's at least 3 ways to do it in every application, and they may have considered it as part of, a programmatic. The programmatic control may be broken, but there may be declarative and a URL-based one. So I think you really have to bring it into your environment. A lot of organizations we're working with do use CVSS, but their own flavor to drive their calculation. I think you have to redo the calculation.
This is actually, to plug our mutual friend Jake, I actually think if you're not familiar with OSVDB, that's actually a really good resource because they log all these kinds of vulnerabilities, and it's an amazing resource for not only tracking an individual vulnerability, but trends as well.
So just to give a little background information, Symantec uses the straight, ordinary CVSS scoring system. And in our vulnerability disclosure reports, we all include mitigation steps. We try to include what the scope of the fix is, as well as the severity, and at least to the best of our knowledge, the likelihood of propagation and being owned, so to speak.
That's very kind of you.
So yes, as has been mentioned a couple times, Microsoft has its own severity scoring system that people have gotten pretty familiar with, and one of the reasons why it's remained in place is because customers have actually built sort of their internal patch processes, patch rollout and patch management processes to trigger on the scoring, and the severity rating system that we have in place at the moment. So, while I certainly work on, I mentioned earlier that I work on the ISO front, I'm also actually part of the CVSS SIG. So it's not like we're not there and we're not thinking about this, but when we think about it, we have to think about it in terms of what do our customers actually need, what our customers ask us for, and in terms of understanding the severity of a particular vulnerability we're addressing, that need is already met currently with the criticality rating system that we have. Plus, a couple years ago, we actually introduced something called the exploitability index. And what that is, it's a rating specific to the vulnerability that, the easiest way for me to explain the difference between our criticality ratings and the exploitability index is criticality ratings, so such as critical, important, moderate, low, that we use, that is the maximum severity if an attacker is successful at exploiting a particular vulnerability, whereas the exploitability index is how likely is it that reliable exploit code will be available in the wild, broadly available, within the first 2 weeks after our patch is released. So that exploitability index is designed to help further prioritize for customers in a tangible way how quickly do I need to apply, this particular patch. So if there are two criticals, one of them may have an XI rating of 1, which is high likelihood that reliable exploit code will be available in the next 2 weeks. That's going to bump up the priority for the customer in applying that patch. And that's exactly the kind of information our customers asked us for in terms of refining how to prioritize when they could deploy those patches. And so that's the information that we gave them.
Thank you. We're starting to run out of time here, so a couple more questions. Or any more questions? All right, good. So it's kind of unfortunate we started late. I had a whole list of questions here, but we cannot get to all of them. So let me just, in that case, open up for concluding remarks. Anything that's on your mind that will not get you in trouble with media here. Please.
Golly. So I think when considering how you're going to deal with vulnerabilities, I think you have to look at a stack of things. Obviously, a lot of my commentary has been with regard to the application level and has considered the difference between product-based vulnerabilities and framework-based vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities in the applications or in common code that may be used by all your applications. You can see that there's a very different level of maturity associated with where you are in those scales. And the fact that we can have computed indices for vulnerability management around platform and around product vendors, I think is interesting, but it's also telling that we don't have those same things in my mind for evaluating application level vulnerabilities that will affect your portfolio of apps. And so I guess a challenge I would have to the OWASP community and the audience is, can you build that same level of calculation and roll-up for some of the other vulnerability types that these guys are not necessarily responsible for handling?
So I guess in keeping with the vulnerability lifecycle theme here and all the different roles in vulnerability discovery and disclosure, I guess I would just put out there that, a lot of times researchers and vendors, erroneously see themselves on opposite sides of a tug of war. And what I really want to emphasize is that the only bad guys are the criminals out there. The only bad guys that we should both be uniting against are, the ones who are actually causing harm, making illicit profit, and really damaging the internet experience for everyone. So I think if we can keep that in mind and kind of operate from that perspective, we're not always going to agree. If we did, there would be no such thing as a disclosure debate. There would, people would just call it vulnerability disclosure and be done with it. So I think the key thing here is remembering we're actually on the same side and working towards that. And I think vendors and researchers can do a lot more in terms of remembering that and keeping the coordination lines open.
I just want to pile on a bit to what we've previously been discussing about customers' process and vulnerability criticality, to your question earlier. I love the fact that Microsoft and Symantec try and tell you whether there's a likelihood of exploitation. These days there's thousands of vulnerabilities released every single year, but it really, you can't just look at criticality, it's exploitability. Finding vulnerabilities at this point, there are a lot of people out there that can find a vulnerability. The exploitation is increasingly difficult. Bypassing things like DEP and ASLR are increasingly difficult. So it's the weaponization that is the more important issue, I think, in this day and age than it is this a critical vulnerability? There's lots of critical vulnerabilities, quite honestly, that never get used. But I guarantee you, if you have SQL injection or cross-site scripting, it's going to get used. It's ridiculously easy. Same thing with anything browser related. ActiveX, any of the plugins, Adobe, etc. If there's a vuln in those, they're going to get leveraged and used. So it goes back to putting yourself in the attacker's shoes and asking yourself, would I use this vulnerability? Not, oh, is it critical, and what's our process for patching that?
Thank you. So regarding Symantec, one thing we really want to do is we want to protect the customer. We're happy to work with other vendors. We're happy to work with other finders. We really don't care how you get to us, but if you're willing to come and work with us, we're happy to give you the best experience we can. That doesn't mean, as Katie said, we agree with you. Otherwise, we would be in some fantasy world. That would be great. And but if, at least with Symantec, if we don't agree or have an issue with your proof of concept, one of my goals is always to keep working with that finder, to keep digging, to make sure I understand my side and they understand their side, in order that we can both agree on whatever the conclusion is and the next steps. We welcome anybody who has any findings of potential vulnerabilities. You can email us at secure@symantec.com. We try to respond as quickly as possible while also getting as much analysis in as possible. Our goal is really just to keep the customer as protected, and that's, I think, what vulnerability management is all about. Thanks.
All right, if you have any further questions that you're afraid to raise your hand and ask, I'm giving you my personal permission to pull any of these guys out. And ask him personally. So thank you all for being here.